Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I have got a wonderful interview for you. I'll be speaking with designer, map maker extraordinaire Ben Olins of Herb Lester Associates. I will explain why I'm speaking to Ben when we get to the interview. Consider yourselves enticed. I have two announcements to make before we get to the interview. First, tickets are officially on sale for the 2025 Agatha Christie Festival in September. I will be making my first solo appearance at the festival. I am not bringing a multitude of co-panelists onto the stage with me. I will be doing a live episode in much the same way that I do most of my episodes these days, all by my lonesome. My talk is titled True Crime Queen, The Real-Life Murders in Agatha Christie's Fiction. I'm going to be talking about true crime in Christie. There is a lot more of it than I think most people realize. This talk will be happening on Thursday, the 18th of September, in the Spanish Barn, but of course, in Tor Abbey, in lovely Torquay, England. I've included two links in the show notes, one to my event specifically, and then another to the literary festival overall, so you can see what else is on offer. This is shaping up to be a really great festival. My friends Mark and Gray over at the Swinging Christies are also doing a live episode. We've got all sorts of mystery authors appearing. Dr. John Curran will be there once again. Christie biographer Laura Thompson. Christie publisher David Braun, who I spoke with at a previous festival. We made an episode out of that. So many good friends appearing at the festival, including Tony Medower, Dr. Michelle Kasmer, David Morris of Collecting Christie, Dr. Jamie Berntal Hooker, Dr. Mark Aldridge will be doing his own event as well. Just a ton of fantastic content. So if you can make it, if you're thinking about making it, click on those links and buy some tickets. They're going fast, as they always do. So I would do that sooner rather than later. Second, I just want to remind you all really quickly that I will be in the southern United States in about 1 month's time doing another tour for my second mystery novel, Loose Lips, set entirely on a cruise ship. Murder on a Boat. Perhaps you have heard of it before. I have actually added a new event to this tour, and it is in the DC area. So if you live in Washington, DC or near DC, I am coming to a bookstore near you. Take heed. So here is the rundown real quick. On Sunday, May 4th, I will be partaking in a Kensington Books Cozy Con in conjunction with the Bookworm Bookstore. This convention will be in Marietta, Georgia from 10 a.m. to 4 o'clock p.m. I was able to have some really nice in-depth conversations with listeners at the Cozy Cons that I did in New Jersey and Pennsylvania earlier this year. So please do come out to this one if you can. You'll also learn about a whole bunch of other great mysteries and mystery authors on offer at Kensington Books. Then on Tuesday, May 6th, I'll be appearing at Fred and June's Books in Mooresville, North Carolina at 6:30 p.m. On Thursday, May 8th, I will be participating in the Junior League of Richmond, Virginia's 80th book and author event. There is a luncheon and tea that starts at 12 noon, and then an evening event at 6 o'clock p.m. I won't go into all the details. You can click on the link to my website for more information. And then finally, on Friday, May 9th, I will be appearing at People's Book in Tacoma Park, Maryland. This is the DC area event, and that will be at 6 o'clock. Please do come out and see me. If you think you can make it to any of these events, click on the link to my website in the show notes. You can also always shoot me a message. I'm at allaboutthedame@gmail.com if you have any questions about any of those appearances. I want to make this as easy as possible for all of you, and I want to see as many of you as I possibly can at these events. Okay, now that we have gotten that out of the way, let's get to this interview that I did with Ben, which I'll just note up top is very much focused on my late co-host and partner in this podcast, Catherine Brobeck. Ben and I are going to be talking about her a whole lot, and you know that that is something that I like to do from time to time. I like to keep Catherine's memory fresh, and there is a really good and timely reason for doing so. All right, enough preamble. Let's get to it. My guest today has an unusual job description for one making an appearance on the All About Agatha podcast. Ben Olins is not a mystery author or a mystery scholar. He is not even a devotee of Agatha Christie, as far as I know, although I will be asking him about that later. How could I not? Books are not even the medium within which he plies his trade. Oh no, Ben is a map maker, a cartographer, but the maps he makes are very special, very strange. Back in 2010, he founded the UK-based small press Herb Lester Associates, first publishing more straightforward travel guides, but he soon transitioned into creating illustrated maps that, as I see it, fall into two broad categories. First are the maps that document the distinct in various cities all over the world. And second are the maps that chart locations associated with literature, rock and roll, the occult, and wider popular culture. We are going to be discussing the latter category a lot more than the former. But in terms of documenting the distinctive, Herb Lester offers a bunch of guides to the, quote, usual and unusual in cities such as Melbourne, Reykjavik, Stockholm, Valencia, Venice, Helsinki, Hamburg, Havana, and so many others. That's just a smattering. They also offer a guide to the solar system. Really? And I believe this one is sold out at the moment, but I was very intrigued by The Skies Above, which is a guide to UFO sightings in the UK. And then when it comes to charting locations associated with literature, music, and more, I think the easiest way to explain what Ben does is just to read off the titles of a few of these offerings. David Bowie's London, the Raymond Chandler map of Los Angeles, the Hard-Boiled Apple, the case file on suspense writing in and about New York City, and many, many, many more. Basically, he marries the real with the fictional by showing us unusable and extremely beautiful maps where we might find various points of interest having to do with an author or artist's work, as well as that author's life as it relates to their work. Ben finds experts for each of these maps who do deep and thorough research to come up with the relevant entries for these maps. And before we get to the map that we'll be focusing on today, I have to point out two others I know will be of particular interest to All About Agatha listeners. I am the proud owner of both these maps. The first is This Deadly Isle, a Golden Age mystery map. The map is of England, of course, and the entries are written by Martin Edwards, the author of multiple works of nonfiction about the golden age of detective fiction. He is also a mystery author in his own right, and the current president of the Detection Club. My late co-host Catherine Brobeck and I interviewed Martin for the Agatha Christie Festival in 2020, and he's just a leading light when it comes to contemporary mystery scholarship. So he's the perfect person to create the entries for a map charting the golden age of detective fiction in England. And then the other map I wanted to highlight is Agatha Christie's England, the entries for which were written by mystery scholar and host of the fabulous podcast, She Done It, Caroline Crampton. If you listen to All About Agatha, there's an extremely good chance you listen to She Done It, and if you don't, you should. Caroline is also a perfect choice for this map, centered on Christie's works in England, and you can bet I will be asking Ben about this map a little later in the episode. Before I blather on any longer, I think it's probably a good idea for us to at least hear our guest's voice. Welcome, Ben.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I was so thrilled to have you on. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, your business is such an unusual one. And I'm really curious how you got into it, because it's obvious to me that you are passionate about literature and music and other aspects of culture, or else you wouldn't do what you do. But to express yourself by way of these travel guides is unique. So I'd love if you could just give us a sense of how you came to do what you do.
Well, like a lot of things, that it makes sense looking back rather than when you begin on a project. So I didn't set out to become a map maker or to publish maps. The original plan was I started a company with someone else and we were going to make publications for companies. My background is in much more editorial journalism, but we thought, well, let's go to companies and say you can make an interesting publication and we can do it for you and we'll get some money and that'd be great. The problem with that is that they didn't want to work with very small operation, and they felt uncertain of what we could do. We decided to produce a kind of calling card. And at that point, we had no office, which was a source of some inconvenience. But we had lots of places to meet and work. So we thought, let's do a map of the places to meet and work in London that we use. And that's useful for people like us. But it also shows that you can present an idea in a very simple idea, very inexpensive on a single sheet of paper. And we did that. And that actually became what we did, because I started to get a bit of publicity for it and sell it to shops. And quite quickly, I realized that I'd much rather be doing that, working on an idea that was my own, rather than trying to pitch things to people that weren't particularly interested. And so that was it. And from there, it very quickly became a kind of a travel publishing business, really.
That's so interesting. So maps then were just a way of showing a third party who could potentially become a paying third party, look at all the information that we can convey in this single, rather stylish document.
What's always interesting to me is that, we're all working with the same palette, really, editors and writers. We've all got access to the same stuff. It's just how you present it. Can you present it in a way that's different and fresh and makes people look at it in a slightly unexpected way? It gives them a slightly unexpected vision of the same thing, effectively. Because we can all, whether it's the works of Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers or whoever, that information is there, but you can present it in a way that makes it fresh. That intrigues me as a kind of editor.
Yeah, and I think it intrigues a lot of people as fans. I think that's a really good way of putting it. A lot, these maps are delighting in an author or an oeuvre or whatever, or a movement, and doing it by way of a different angle from the way that we usually express our interest in these books or people. And then also, of course, creating this document that is beautiful and can be either hung up. It would be quite big, I think, to try to actually put it on a wall or something like that, but to use and to refer to, but also to be able to look at. And they fold up nicely into these little pouches that kind of close up, without the need of any adhesive tape or anything like that. It's all just very neat and purposeful and intentional. And you can tell that there's a lot put into the visuals of this as well, which is a big part of it. Okay, so listeners could potentially be really confused as to why exactly we're having this conversation, although there is, of course, the Agatha Christie map, and you do actually do a lot of work with mystery content, and we will talk about that a little later in the episode. But first and foremost, I really want to go into the main reason that we are having this conversation today and why I was so determined to have you come on to the podcast, because it's an unusual reason. Way back in July 2021, you actually emailed me and my co-host, Catherine Brobeck, because you had recently completed Agatha Christie's England, the map that you did with Caroline Crampton. And Caroline, I believe, had mentioned to you that we were two people who might be interested in checking it out. And indeed we were. Catherine wrote back to you immediately. And in the back and forth that you two had, I think I was on vacation at the time, or holiday, as you would say. So I was sort of out of it, and you and Catherine kind of went, off to the races with your correspondence in my absence. But I actually pulled up the email, the main email or the major email that she wrote to you, which I was still CC'd on, and I'm going to quote from it now because this is what Catherine wrote. "I'm an absolute map nerd. Kemper, if he's reading this, is going to roll his eyes back so hard we might kill him. I make maps for other people, and my mother has an actual box of fictional maps I drew as a child. So unbeknownst to you, I am your key demographic, smiley face. Should you ever want someone to write a guide to Joan Didion's 1960s/1970s Los Angeles, I'd sort of be able to think of someone." That is such a Catherine message. And this led to more back and forth between you and Catherine about moving forward with a map of Joan Didion's Los Angeles, all the places where she and her friends and colleagues lived over the years in LA, because she lived here for many, many years, and which she references in her many works of both fiction and nonfiction. I just wonder if you could tell me a little bit about that process from your perspective, how you and Catherine got started on creating this Joan Didion map together.
Well, I think the first thing is I got that message, and it was lovely to get a reply, because so often I email people and don't get any response, let alone one as delightful as that. And Joan Didion was someone I'd already been interested. I think vaguely thought about doing something, because I enjoy her writing, and she does seem so place-based. So much what she writes is about places. Mm-hmm. And so I probably tried to play it a bit cool But I was certain from the very start that would be a fantastic idea. Obviously, you knew that Catherine was articulate and clever and interesting, and the perfect person to do it. From listening to All About Agatha, and even really from that email, which I think my entire relationship with Catherine was through email, but they were all like that, very very engaging,
very very witty and effervescent writer.
Yeah.
Yes. Knowing her over email is actually a pretty good way to get to know her, because her written word was always entertaining.
And so she suggested this, and I said yes. And sometimes in this process, I take more of a leading role, and I say what I want and what I think it should be and what my idea for it is. But in this instance, she clearly had such a clear idea of what she wanted it to be, how she envisaged it. And she was so in command of the subject. I think I kind of said, whatever you want to do is fine. I think it's going to be great. Let me try to find a designer that can do it justice, and send me a long list, and I'll take a look at it, and then we'll go from there. That's kind of how I remember it. I haven't gone over those emails. Maybe I should have done.
No, that makes sense. And that's pretty much how I remember it too. I mean, I think once we got that Agatha Christie's England map, she knew exactly what I think the Didion LA version of that would look like. And that's such a good point that Joan Didion is such a place-oriented writer. She talks about places, and also not just sort of, where, a story is set or where someone is from, but her relationship to places. I mean, I think Joan Didion's relationship to California, is something that she writes about a lot, and, how her family even goes back multiple generations, and how she lived here for as long as she did and in various parts of California. But LA, where she spent so much time, and where she, where her family lived, and, she and her husband, there's just so much that happened here over so many years. And I think it was immediately obvious to her what she was going to do. And I think she really had, too much content, which is always a good place to be, right? Where you have to whittle down rather than trying to figure out how you're going to fill out.
Oh yeah, it hurts the time. It hurts the time, but it's definitely the right place to be. Better that than be sort of scurrying around trying to dredge stuff up that isn't
right. Scrounging. Yeah. There was no scrounging happening, I think, when it came to Didion, because Catherine really was a lifelong devotee. Everyone on this podcast knows how much she loved Agatha Christie, but she really was a voracious and, I'd say omnivorous reader. She read in all genres, and Didion was just one of her, I think, North Stars. And she wrote as well. And I think to many people who are writers, it's impossible not to admire Didion as a writer. In addition to as a reader, it's almost like two separate sorts of fandoms when it comes to her. So you consume her writing as a reader, but then you also start looking at the way she constructs her sentences and how precise and elegant they are, and spare, which is actually something she has in common with Agatha Christie, I would argue. I was really desperately, when I was preparing for this episode, I was like, I'm going to try to find as much commonality between Didion and Christie as I can. And I'm not going to force that issue. I don't think we have to, because Catherine is our overlap here between Didion and Christie, but there are a few. And to state the obvious here, as you know, and as pretty much everyone listening to this podcast knows, Catherine passed away unexpectedly, less than 4 months actually after she first wrote to you, because that was in July of 2021, and she passed away in November of 2021, while she was still in the middle of putting together all those entries for the map. And she would check in with me about it from time to time, and I would ask her about it. And she just was always drowning in content. Like, she just had so much, and she was just trying to wade through all of it and figure out what she could use, what she shouldn't use, how to tie various places into Didion's work, which were better tie-ins, which could she possibly jettison. And it was a process, and she was very much in the middle of it when she passed away. And for me, it was one of the many creative projects that she had been working on that she wasn't able to complete. Another one of those was the ranking of all of Agatha Christie's novels on this very podcast. So for a while, I was occupied with that endeavor. But eventually, you and I started to speak about finishing the Joan Didion map, whether that was even possible. the personnel credit with our beginning to speak, the major reason we started talking was that Catherine's mother, Linda Brobeck, approached both of us. And Linda is no stranger to this podcast. She was my excellent co-host for the final book that we covered on All About Agatha, which was Curtain. Not the last to be published, but the last to be covered on All About Agatha. And I'm so grateful to her for doing that. She had been able to retrieve the file of entries that Catherine had been working on her laptop. She had to go to, one of those tech geniuses and sort of extract what she could from her computer. And then she shared that with us in the effort to try to complete this project somehow. It was very important to her. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that point in time on this project, which led us to working together to help finish this map for Catherine.
Yes. Well, obviously it was a terrible shock. And I hadn't quite realized that it was such a short time that we'd been working on this together. I guess because it already felt so coherent as a project. But yes, Linda got in touch with me and she was absolutely adamant that if it was possible, she wanted to be published, she wanted to be finished. And I thought that was a great thing to do. I felt, it's hard to talk about this without being kind of mawkish, which is not what I intend to be, but it felt like a way to pay tribute to her. And it's a little weird because she's not someone I knew. I knew her from a handful of emails, really. But to pay tribute to her and to see it through rather than let it kind of wither, because it was a great idea, and I think it meant a lot to her. And so I was aware that it, in turn, meant a lot to Linda, and I wanted it to be. I just felt it was the right thing for it to be done on a kind of emotional level, but also it was the right thing to be done, but on a purely business level, because I thought this is a really great publication that should come out, and I want to do it.
Yeah. Well, the other crazy thing that happened is that Joan Didion herself passed away just a few weeks after Catherine, really. I think about 6 weeks. That was also at the end of 2021. And I remember when that happened thinking to myself, okay, we really need to do this. Catherine would be so annoyed if this map never came out. And I am by no means an expert on Joan Didion. I just want to put that out there. And I know you, Ben, are not either. I think we're both sort of, casual fans, more casual fans of her. And I'm not going to get into the weeds of Joan Didion on this episode. As I mentioned, there's not a ton of overlap, I think, between Didion and Christie. They're very different writers. They're from different eras. They wrote in a different medium for the most part. Joan Didion did write a handful of novels, but she's best known for her essays and her works of longer nonfiction. I think she even has a different aim when it comes to what she's trying to achieve with her writing. She was obsessed with cultural figures and movements and moods, and explicating their significance, sort of placing them within a larger context. Whereas I think Christie confined herself to individual stories, though confined is totally the wrong word to use. She too weighed in on cultural figures and movements and moods just as much as Didion did, but her means of expression was much more oblique. It was through these mysteries that she wrote. I actually really wish that Joan Didion had tried her hand at examining Christie's influence at some point when she was writing nonfiction, because I'm sure that she would have drawn some fascinating and unforeseen conclusions about what Agatha Christie means in the world. But that never happened, unfortunately. Oh, that would just be my dream essay. But yeah, I mean, beyond the fact that they were both unusually spare writers who I think wrote with a propulsive force, that I think is probably the biggest commonality between them. I will say this now, having read the bulk of Joan Didion's work, especially when it comes to her nonfiction, her longer nonfiction and her essays, I was never bored reading anything by Joan Didion. And I can, of course, also say that about Agatha Christie. And I think that's unusual to be able to say that about two people who wrote as much as they both did. And I think that's a credit to their writing, which is very different. But I think they are both, in their own very, very different ways, incredibly intentional and precise writers. But I just generally found it daunting to have to dive into all the research that I knew I was going to have to do if I was going to help on this Joan Didion map, if I was going to help you complete it. That's why we're having this conversation in 2025, to be perfectly honest, and not in 2022 or 2023. It took a while for me to carve out the time that I needed to do the work that was required. And I didn't want to skimp on that work because I know that Catherine wouldn't have appreciated that. She had already done all of that. It was sort of, I mean, Didion was in her very being, in her bones, when she conceived of this map. So she, I think, was just able to, transpose a lot of what was in her head and put it on the page of these entries. And then she was kind of going through and I think vetting a lot of it and doing all of the nitpicky work that's required. I had to do all of that second phase as well, but I really had to refamiliarize myself with Joan Didion and read a lot of her essays. And what a pleasure that really was to have such a great reason to sit down and read the works of this great author. But it also just took a lot of time because we're all busy in our lives. And that's sort of how I got involved with you in taking these entries that Catherine had done and completing some of them. I mean, most of what Catherine had actually put in there for the entries was finished. It's just that we needed to add some. We needed to do a little bit, I think, of that editorial work that she was still figuring out, which was, okay, which of these are we going to keep? Which of these are we going to let go of? We need to do a tiny bit more research just to fill out, some of these entries or, add a few that hadn't been in there at all. And, all of that just took some time. And if I'm being honest, I think that the main reason that I found it hard to do and not just a pure pleasure is that every time I worked on this map, I couldn't help picturing how angry and how frustrated Catherine would have felt by the fact that I was doing this project for her. I know that she would have appreciated it given the circumstances and then some. That's an understatement. I, of course, know that. But it just sort of brought home to me the unfairness of the fact that she was no longer here. And I'll stop so that I'm not crying in yet another episode of this podcast. But it just made it a very emotional task and one that I had to do in pieces and over a longer period of time. I'm curious what the process was like from your end, Ben.
Well, I think for me, I was obviously enormously grateful for your help and for Linda's help because I couldn't have done it on my own for many reasons. Partly is that Los Angeles is an extremely complicated city to an outside, and just the geography of it is confounding. But I was conscious that we were beginning to discuss, Catherine and I, the order of how things would work and how it all fit together and what the running order of the entries would be. And that was a conversation we could never finish. So I was aware that, in a way, a bit like you, that that how annoyed she'd be. That I had that in my mind. Like, is this a more conventional approach than she would have taken? Is it, what are we doing here that she'd be disappointed with, and what are we doing here that she'd be happy with? And there was no way for me to know, but it was certainly something that was in my mind. But a bit like, with the editing process, you just have to say, well, this has got to go. This is one entry too many. In this case, that's a thought I've really got to just jettison because I can't have any idea what she's going to think. And I've got to just do, or we've got to do what we think is best, reduce the guide that we think best represents the subject. It makes it clear and enjoyable for the reader. And by doing that, I hope, and I'm sure you do too, that would be something that she'd be happy with. And no doubt, just as everyone looks at things and finds fault and thinks, well, I would have done it differently. No doubt, there are things where she would have said, well, I was going to get rid of that, or you should have put that in somewhere else, but that's how it is, and that's what we came up with. But her presence was loomed large over the whole thing. Yeah.
It really did, and I agree. You sort of just have to settle for second best, right? We did our best to try to finish what she started, but obviously I'm sure she would have all sorts of complaints with with what the finished product is, and I wish that I could hear them. But it's funny. Joan Didion herself actually talks a little bit about that very issue in one of her later memoirs when she was actually editing the last novel that her husband, John Gregory Dunn, was working on when he passed away. He had a heart attack at their dinner table and passed away very suddenly. And she wrote The Year of Magical Thinking about that. And then right around the same time experienced yet another horrific loss of their daughter. And then she wrote another memoir, Blue Nights, about that. So she has these two very late career memoirs that really focus on this personal loss that she experienced. And she talks a little bit about trying to edit the book and trying to figure out what he wanted to say and do, and how she was going to, negotiate that with just sort of the requirements of the task at hand. And yeah, we muddled through and hopefully made it the best we could. It's actually, though, returning to those memoirs is one of the reasons, one of my contributions to it. I referenced The Year of Magical Thinking and Blue Nights directly in a couple of these entries. And I know as originally conceived, as you can even tell from that email that Catherine wrote, this really was supposed to be Didion of the 1960s and 1970s in Los Angeles. But she did return for a little bit when her daughter actually was hospitalized and quite seriously ill. And she didn't pass away right at that point, but there was this late return that sort of gets referenced in Blue Nights, and a couple of other little connections that I could make with The Year of Magical Thinking. And I just liked the idea of incorporating those books about loss into this map as I was working on it. But I know that was not the original conception of it. But that's one way in which I sort of leaned in to, what this project had become and the fact that it had morphed into something a little bit different after she passed away.
I think those work very well. And I also think that for a lot of people, she became a much bigger cultural figure later in life. And it's those later books that probably have been read more at this stage and been talked about more. So it made sense to me to bring it back to that later period.
Yeah. Yeah. Then there's even actually a new book that's coming out, I believe this month, which is sort of letters that she wrote to a therapist.
Maybe that's how she's going to talk about Agatha Christie.
I'm sure one of those letters is squarely focused on Agatha Christie. And I was just reading, The Pale Horse. That's an interesting one. Yeah, there's almost just an endless appetite, I think, for Didion. And she did, I think, take on a slightly different cultural significance in those later years. I think a bit to her chagrin, actually, but then almost everything was to Joan Didion's chagrin. She had a very active sense of chagrin, as did Catherine Brobeck. So they also shared that.
Quite nice for her that she wasn't just a kind of one of these people who is only known for what they did in their youth. She was known for her what she did in her late years. And I think it must be hard for so many of these kind of towering figures where people are really only interested in what they did, 60 years ago.
Absolutely.
She had this, this resurgence of interest in her with the documentary and those books and the ad campaign and all that stuff. Although, yes, I'm sure she was not unequivocal about it.
And I wonder how she would have felt about this book being published posthumously. Although apparently the way that they found it in her records, it was so meticulously filed, it almost felt like it was being prepared for publication. But maybe that's also just wishful thinking on, those who are going to gain from publication of this book. But yes, that's true. And dare I say another commonality with Christie. Christie is someone who only became more popular later on in life. And even though there's some, this is a big debate, did Christie's books actually decline in quality in the 60s? I think certainly not as much as many people believe that they did. I think they took on a slightly different quality, but she just became a bigger and bigger and bigger bestseller and more of a phenomenon the older that she got. So she certainly did not peak earlier on in her career and then just try to regain that popularity. And it is interesting that Didion had something similar happen there. I think you could say she was never more popular than in the last 2 decades, actually, of her life. So that's really interesting. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I would just love to learn how you went about the process of creating this map, like the actual design of the Didion map and all of your maps, because I have to assume that there's a fairly universal process here, but it sounds like you work with different designers as well. Because to be clear, and I will have links in the show notes to this episode, and I do encourage everyone to go to the Herblester website because you can see what some of these maps look like. It's a little hard to describe it without actually just having the visual in front of you, but the maps themselves, again, they're to scale. Like you're actually including the maps of cities and city streets in different areas, and you do sort of, you'll have pop-up windows where you zoom into a certain location if you need to, because there's so many locations within a certain neighborhood or county if it's a map of a country. But then on the flip side of these maps is where you have your entries, and there are often a lot of visuals there as well. You'll include little visuals for some of the places that are being highlighted on the map. And I'll just use the Didion map for an example. One of the entries has to do with the Bistro, which is this very old school Beverly Hills restaurant where Joan Didion spent a lot of time doing business meetings, but she also went there to celebrate when they adopted, she and John Gregory Dunn adopted their daughter, Quintana, and her brother-in-law, who looms very large in this map because he loomed large in her life there, Dominic Dunn. He was actually one of the people who owned the restaurant. So, you have on top of the entry, a very, almost like, I would say it looks a little Art Deco-ish, but a very stylized sketch of the bistro. And you do that for other restaurants and houses and parks and whatnot in this map and in other maps. So do you have a sort of house style that you're working with when you're creating these maps, or does it depend on the designer, or I'm just curious how all of that works?
No, there isn't a house. It really depends on the designer, but the designer is obviously chosen by me. So it's all kind of filtered through my taste. So I think there is a kind of a consistency to the different guides, even though they are, many of them, almost all of them, done by someone different, because there are things that I like and I look for. And when I identify those, that's when I choose someone to do these. So there's a kind of, there's a thread. I couldn't actually tell you what that thread is. It's just something I like and see it, and I then get the people to do it. But no, there isn't a house style. But what there is there's an approach. So, there is an approach where I say I want some illustrations within the text. I want a big map. We need to zoom in on this bit because there's more detail here required. But I didn't want to make the style too regimented because I knew I'd get bored. And then I'd just start to kind of water it down and tinker with it. Whereas if you approach each one fresh, each one's exciting to work on. And each one then should be a pleasant surprise for the readers there are people who buy every one or most of them. So they don't quite know what they're going to get. It's not just the same thing. It's not like a beautiful kind of old penguin where the joy is the uniformity.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely different.
Yeah. That's interesting that you use almost a different designer for every map, because I have the three now. I have Agatha Christie's England, This Deadly Isle, and of course Joan Didion's Los Angeles. And I would say the unifying physical characteristic that comes through the most obviously to me is almost a sense of playfulness. Like, none of these illustrations is literal, but they're all recognizable. So, you'll have an illustration of the Tower Bridge, and it's kind of like all of the elements required to make it obvious that, yes, this is the Tower Bridge are there, but no more. Like, it's not laborious. It's not sort of like, there's nothing photographic about these visuals, which also to me seems like that's part of the point, because they all feel like they're artistic endeavors and that they have been filtered through a design process and an editorial process, so that what you're getting here is something that has been curated and sort of cultivated by people. And it's not just like something that you could snap. It certainly doesn't feel like it was made by AI. It's the hands of humans, I think, are just very apparent in these maps. And for me, that's a large part of the draw. And I have to imagine that is on purpose.
Yeah, I think it is on purpose. But I tend to think these things, they are maps, but they're not. They wouldn't be very useful in getting you from A to B, or certainly not from A to Z. So I think of them almost more as schematics, more like the London Underground maps, where it shows you where things are in relation to each other. And then you need some identifying points within that. So so you need landmarks to help you orient yourself. No, it's not about accurate representations of places or even the entire geographic layout. It's about how things relate to each other, but also visually it's about creating a mood. So in the three you mentioned, two of them actually are by the same person, because they were so linked thematically, Deadly Isle and Agatha Christie, that I wanted the same person to do them.
Oh, they are? Okay, that makes me feel better.
No, they are. And actually, I think, the palette of the Didion is not a million miles off those two either. So I see they do share something, but I think most of them share something. But that's, I want them to have the mood, the tone, the atmosphere of the subject, rather than strictly representing it.
Yeah. That's why I was being cheeky when I called you a cartographer. I don't have a feeling you don't introduce yourself that way at cocktail parties.
No, I don't go to enough cocktail parties, to be honest. But
I was just going to say, can't really think of the last time that I went to a cocktail party. I think those died with COVID, if not before then. But
possibly been reading too much Agatha Christie.
Right. But it's very modernist. I think the idea that this is about the relation of things, between themselves, not about the things in and of themselves. So it's a very subjective as opposed to objective reality that you are depicting here, which is just appropriate too when you're trying to consider the works of a single author or the sort of musical influence of an artist in one city or something. It is about how these things play with each other and interact together. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that there are a lot of people out there, just even beyond the interest in basic subject matter, who can get a lot out of these, because they really are works of art. So, yeah, I remember when I first got the Agatha Christie's England map, of course, I had the usual delight in, oh, wow, Caroline is talking about so many different, Christie stories and making so many connections. But it is this sort of sum greater than its parts kind of phenomenon. That's, I think, each map to be successful, I think, does somehow have to be a sum greater than its parts. And you pulled it off for these three. So I have to imagine that's happening with the others as well.
Yeah, they're about dropping the person into the world that we're talking about. That's kind of it. So you shouldn't need to go to. It's great, obviously, if you can go to LA to see Joan Didion's city, but you could be sitting, wherever, and you look at the map, and it should somewhat transport you, and that's the job of the visuals, and that's also why the detail of getting from one place to another is not so important, because if you're actually there, you're going to probably use your phone. I mean, I have to accept that, as galling as it may be. So yeah, they are about, the idea is to transport you.
Absolutely. And I think just talking a moment about Agatha Christie's England, because how could we not on this podcast? Certainly, this map is not meant to be pulled out and sort of, used as someone is traversing from Cornwall up into Scotland and beyond. So it's, I think, a map for people who love Christie, and I think can sort of glean a little bit more from her and what she does as to location than they would be able to just reading the books singly. And I'll give a specific example of that. I was really struck when I was looking at this map as to how southern focused Christie really is when it comes to England. And that's not a surprise. She grew up in Devon. She still lived in Devon throughout her entire life at times. She had her holiday home there. And then, of course, she was in London for much of her life. So it makes sense that she would set more of her stories in the more southern parts of England than in the northern parts, where she tends to get a little vague when it comes to the locations of towns and country houses and whatnot. And Caroline did her best. I mean, she has a bunch of the more northern ones where she was like, well, this could be somewhere, this could be this house, or this area is referenced in these novels or these short stories. But, there's so much in Torquay, for instance, Agatha Christie's birthplace, that you had to do a pullout for that. So you actually have a bunch of entries that are clustered right in that sort of Torbay harbor, and then a ton that's in Devon as well, because there are just so many stories set on Dartmoor, or that at least reference Dartmoor in more or less direct ways. And all of that is really captured on the map. And I think it's just an interesting takeaway for people. So you were just telling me, actually, off mic before we started this, that you are coming out with another mystery author focused map in the coming months, which I think will be of interest to listeners. So could you just tell us about that one?
That's right. Yeah. In September, we have a Dorothy L. Sayers Britain map coming out, which I'm very much looking forward to, because I am quite a big Dorothy L. Sayers fan. And again, that's interesting because she's also pretty tightly focused, London, Oxford. She goes to Wales and Scotland, I think, a little bit, but she really writes about what she knows, and thus we pull out on those two cities. But
I was just going to say, you're definitely going to need to pull out on Oxford.
That's a lot, and it's even within Oxford, she kind of really writes about Somerville, where she went, and she disguises it, and it's really, really tightly focused. But it's interesting, that these people went back to the same things, and they just write about what's familiar. I guess it's important to them, and also it's easier to describe places you really know than to imagine somewhere.
You opened the door for this question since you said that you're a Dorothy L. Sayers fan, but I have to ask, are you an Agatha Christie fan? Do you consider yourself a Christie fan? I promise if the answer is no, that I won't get mad at you.
Well, it's funny because I listen to All About Agatha, and I really enjoy it. And sometimes I'll hear people say, well, I don't really read the books. I just sort of listen to it on the radio, or I've watched the TV series, and I sort of laugh at them and think, oh God, how awful. And then I realize, actually, I think I've read a couple of novels when I've been away somewhere, and there's been one in a bookshelf and picked it up and enjoyed it. But I feel so familiar with her work because I've watched a lot and I've listened to even more, I think. So I am a fan, but I'm a fan sort of once removed, because I'm a fan of the adaptations, and I feel a terrific fraud admitting that.
There's no shame in that. We have gone over this so many times on this podcast, and it's a little Christie specific because I think it's just so robust, right? Like the adaptational landscape when it comes to Christie is just, you could spend years upon years upon years just watching Christie adaptations. And I think it's just seeped into the very culture, certainly where you are in England, but even here in the US, that I think for a lot of mystery fans, like that is their primary means of access to Christie. I mean, for Catherine, it was actually, Catherine really, she had read all the books, obviously, eventually, but her first interaction with them was through the David Suchet series and some of the other adaptations. Mine was much more textual. That was one of the ways in which I think we were a good pairing, but nothing wrong with that.
Well, but the weird thing is, I'll watch the new adaptations and sort of laugh at them and say, "This is not right at all. This is nothing like the book." Realizing actually, I'm comparing it to an adaptation from 30 years earlier, and I don't really know what I'm talking about.
Well, you know what? You're probably right anyway, though, Ben, that it is nothing like the books.
I might. I feel I'm on stronger ground with some of the. We've done Raymond Chandler, and that I'm on pretty firm ground. I've read all that, and But yes, I wanted to do Agatha Christie because I do really enjoy the world she created and the characters she created, and I just felt it would be an interesting project, and I was quite interested to see, as you said, you get. When you do a map, you see what that writer knew, and to see it as a map was very interesting. That she basically didn't know the North at all, not really interested, didn't understand it, which is what you would expect of someone of her background and from where she came. And
yeah, I've sort of gotten on my little soapbox and talked about this so many times. Everyone feel free to roll your eyes right now. But, Christie is still, I think, so misapprehended as someone who did not tie her writing to real places, to real times, just to real settings overall. And that really is partially because of the adaptations, because many of those adaptations did make the choice to sort of place everything in a little bit more of a fictional feeling landscape, this sort of idyllic mid-century Britain that everyone knows didn't really exist. But that's just simply not what she did in her books. I mean, she was always trying to recreate her reality. And I think she was actually quite careful about that. And it was very important to her, I think, that her books, because there was such unbelievable things happening in the books. And that was just, there was no way of getting around that. That was the genre in which she was writing, because there had to be basically multiple murders in every one of these books, with all sorts of crazy red herrings. I think it was very important to her to set those stories in real feeling places. And it makes perfect sense to me that, as someone who didn't get up into the North as much, not like she never went there or anything, but like she definitely spent the bulk of her time more in the South, it makes sense that she just would have stayed there when she was creating these communities. And there are allusions to the North, but you just wouldn't necessarily realize it, I think, until you're looking at the oeuvre as a whole. And that's exactly why, and it's sort of when we started this conversation, you said, why did you start making maps in the first place? That's what you were trying to prove, right? Well, look at how much information we can convey. Look at the sorts of points that we can make via a physical map that you're not going to be able to do in any other form. And there's a lot of value to that where an author's works are concerned. So I really enjoyed Agatha Christie's England. Obviously, Catherine did, so much so that she then felt the urge to make a map of her own. I'm sure that there are a bunch of listeners on this podcast who are also devotees of Joan Didion. And even if you're not, and you are curious about her, as we were saying, these maps are very much for the curious. And I think if you're curious about Joan Didion or about any of these other authors, I would encourage you all to check some of them out, but in particular to check this map out in memory of Catherine Brobeck, because I know that would please her. And I should just mention, as we close things out here, that all of Herb Lester's maps are lithoprinted in England on sustainably sourced paper, which is a slower, more costly process than digital printing, but you really can see and feel the difference in the quality of the maps. And again, I speak from experience here. I'm looking at them right now. They really are all gorgeous. And even though the press is located in England, through the magic of the internet, you can order them anywhere in the world. They will be shipped right to you. As I already mentioned earlier in the episode, I've got a bunch of links in the show notes to Catherine's map on Joan Didion, also to those mystery themed maps, and then just to the general Herb Lester catalog, because there's so much great content there. If you have the means and the inclination to buy Catherine's map in particular, it would be very meaningful to me, because I just love the idea of some of you listeners having a physical reminder of Catherine, in addition to all the audio reminders that you already have. And I'm just really happy that we were able to put out this map and that it can be in existence. I do have just one final question for you, Ben. Who is Herb Lester?
Wow. That's probably the question I've been asked more than any other.
I have to imagine, yes.
when we began this company, I wanted to be a person's name, and I didn't want to use my own name. And so, as a kind of exercise, well, who would you like to work for? Describe who you'd like to work for. Describe this person. And then you've got to find a name for them. And at that point, we were watching The Wire a lot, the TV show The Wire. And someone said, "Oh, well, you describe Lester from The Wire, who was the detective who was very patient and painstaking and didn't seem to do very, but every now and then he just leapt into action and did it all perfectly and solved it all and made it all." He didn't really solve it. Wire wasn't really a solving type TV show, you know what I mean? He dealt with issues, and he was a comforting presence. He felt like he'd seen it all, done it all, and then he knew what to do with. Nothing would faze him. And then I look at a lot of old records for inspiration for titles and things, and it just felt like Herb Lester sounds like the kind of guy who might have written a sleeve notes to an old, jazz record, 50s. Sounds kind of comforting. Sounds like someone I might want to work for. Experienced, not much to prove. So there we need them, but not too hard a taskmaster. So that was it. That's who Herb Lester is. He's someone in my imagination. But it's good to have a boss, because you can then say, well, as Ben, I don't know what to do, but what would Herb do? What would Herb think?
Or if you have some, a tough sort of situation, you're like, well, I guess we'll just bump that up the chain to good old Herb.
Yeah.
We'll see what he says. Lester Freeman. I cannot believe that you named that Herb Lester Associates is named after Lester Freeman from.
Yeah, I've never revealed that in public before. That is the source of it, and
that's better than I could have hoped for.
I'm pleased. It's good to have a good origin story. It's not quite Superman's, but it'll do.
It also does. It sort of situates it in time, because 2010, right? That's when you started. That sort of in the first. You're in the still like the immediate. I don't even want to say aftermath. That sounds pejorative. The first flush, let's say, of The Wire having first been out, and I think it was on a lot of people's minds probably in 2010, more so than now. But it probably should always be on our minds, because I'm a Wire stan. Actually, never had a reason to talk about that on All About Agatha before, but I absolutely love The Wire, as so many people do. Yeah. So that's fantastic.
The two things don't seem to go together, do they? The Wire and Agatha Christie, but I'm sure there is some overlap.
There's a paper in there somewhere. That will be a chapter in some sort of academic study on Agatha Christie, probably before 2030. Mark my words. You heard it here first. Well, then, I mean, I have to thank you, obviously, for coming onto the podcast and sharing all of this with us. But most importantly, I want to thank you for seeing Catherine's vision through to the end, because I think you're very humble and modest about, doing your best and, trying to complete this project of hers and do her justice. But quite honestly, that was something that didn't have to necessarily be done. And certainly now, having been the person who worked with you to make this happen, it was a pleasure and a real comfort to work with someone who is as thoughtful and I think as understanding and empathetic just about the crazy situation that this was vis-a-vis losing Catherine. And I just want to thank you for being my partner of sorts on this strange project. And again, I'm just so happy that this map exists and that we have it to look at and to think about, because it just adds to the memory of Catherine Brobeck, and that's a wonderful thing.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really hugely grateful to you, and of course to Linda, and most of all, to Catherine for instigating this. And I'm really, really happy that we did it. It's been a long process, and I'm really thankful it's out there, and I hope people like it. And as we've both been saying, I really hope Catherine wouldn't hate it too much.
That is a good way of putting it. Yes, I have moderate confidence that she wouldn't entirely hate the product that's out there now.
If only we could put that as a blurb on the back.
Right. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Ben Olins of Herb Lester Associates, or Herb Lester Associates, as he would say, and it is his company. Still can't get over the fact that there's a Wire connection. to the name of his company. That is so fantastic. As I mentioned while Ben and I were speaking, I have included links in the show notes to Catherine's Joan Didion map, those 2 mystery-centric maps that we discussed, and to the Herb Lester catalog overall. These maps really are beautiful, and the project meant so much to Catherine, so I really encourage you to take a look, and if you're so inclined, to make a purchase, or 2, or 3, or more. Also, these maps are available in lots of independent bookstores in the UK and the US and elsewhere, both physically in the stores and by way of online ordering. So just keep that in mind as well. Lots of different ways to buy these maps. For next week's episode, I am so excited to have Sarah Hinlicky Wilson back on the podcast as my co-host. We will be covering another one of those religious stories in the Star Over Bethlehem and Other Stories collection. This episode will be coinciding with the Easter holiday, so it is going to be a Christie for Easter. And the specific story we'll be discussing, in case you want to read it ahead of time, is In the Cool of the Evening. Very, very much looking forward to having Sarah back on the podcast. And then over on Patreon for April, I am releasing a discussion of The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green. This is a foundational mystery novel, an American mystery first published in 1878. Agatha Christie cited it as an influence. She name-checked it and spoke about it at some length through the character of Monsieur Poirot in The Clocks. Very important text to mystery and Christie scholars, and a really fun mystery to read. I had a lot of fun covering that one. So click on the link in the show notes to Patreon if you would like to check out that bonus content. You can always send me an email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Author, and you can also find a general link to my website in the show notes. As I mentioned up top, I am going on tour in the South, in the Southern United States, at the beginning of May. So I've included a link to my events page in the show notes. Go ahead and check it out, and if you possibly can, please come see me. I would love to see you. Love to chat in person. But if in person is just not in the cards, then leave me a rating or a review and help out the podcast. Give it a little boost. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.